Long before written memory, before calendars learned to count the passing of days, before names were given to God or kings, there were faces staring out from the earth. Faces so large, so heavy, so impossibly carved that even today they seem out of place in the world they inhabit. Imagine walking through dense jungle, the air thick with moisture, insects humming softly like distant static, vines clinging to ancient trees. And then, without warning, the ground opens its secret. A human face emerges from stone, its lips full, its gaze distant, its expression unreadable. It is not a statue meant for a palace or a temple. It is not small enough to be moved by ordinary hands. It weighs tens of tons, and it should not exist. Who carved these faces? Why were they made? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how did a civilization capable of such feats rise so early in human history, only to vanish almost without a trace? For a long time, the world did not even know these faces were there. They slept beneath soil and roots, under centuries of rain and silence. When they were finally uncovered, they challenged everything historians thought they understood about ancient civilizations in the Americas. These stone heads did not belong to the Maya nor the Aztecs. They came from people far older, so old that when the Maya began to build their first cities, the creators of these monuments were already ancient history. The realization arrived slowly, like a chill creeping in during the night. Civilization, it turns out, does not always move forward in neat lines. It rises, it falls, and sometimes it disappears so completely that only stone remains a whisper that it was ever there at all. The faces themselves are calm, almost serene. They do not shout. They do not threaten. Their eyes are heavy-lidded, their mouths firm but not cruel. Some wear what appear to be helmets or headdresses, hinting at authority or ritual. Others seem almost weary, as though they have watched centuries pass and expect many more to come. Standing before one, it is difficult not to feel small, not in fear, but in time. Each head was carved from a single block of basalt, quarried from distant volcanic mountains, and transported across rivers, swamps, and uneven land without metal tools, without wheels, without beasts of burden. The effort required is almost unimaginable. Hundreds of people, perhaps thousands, moving stone through mud and water, guided by shared belief, shared leadership, shared purpose. This was not the work of scattered tribes or temporary settlements. This was organization. This was planning. This was civilization. And yet, for centuries, history books were silent about them. When early explorers and archaeologists first encountered these sculptures in the 19th and early 20th centuries, confusion followed. Some refused to believe they were made by indigenous peoples at all. Others invented fantastical explanations. Lost continents, forgotten races, visitors from distant lands. The truth, quieter and more powerful, took longer to accept. These monuments were the work of a native civilization so early, so influential, that it shaped everything that came after it. Today, we call them the Olmec, but even that name is borrowed, taken from a later language meaning rubber people, a label applied long after their own words were lost to time. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the names of their kings, the prayers they whispered, or the stories they told their children at night. What we have instead are fragments, stone, clay, symbols, and silence. And yet, those fragments speak. They tell us that more than 3,000 years ago, along the warm, humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast of modern-day Mexico, a people began to organize the world in new ways. They shaped landscapes, redirected water, planned cities, and imagined gods that blended human and animal, earth and sky. They thought deeply about power, nature, time, and transformation. And for reasons we still do not fully understand, they eventually let it all go. There's something deeply human in that story. Civilizations are often remembered for their endings, violent collapses, dramatic conquests, fiery destruction. The Olmecs do not offer us that kind of clarity. Their disappearance was not loud. It did not announce itself. It unfolded slowly, quietly, like a fire burning low, until only embers remain. Cities were abandoned. Ritual centers fell silent. Stone monuments were buried, sometimes intentionally, as if placed gently back into the earth. This quietness is what makes the Olmecs so haunting. When you look into the face of one of their colossal heads, You are not just seeing a ruler or a symbol. You are seeing endurance, stone that has outlasted belief systems, languages, entire worlds. You are seeing a reminder that human ambition can carve mountains, yet still surrender to time. And perhaps that is why these faces feel so unsettling and so calming at the same time. They do not demand attention. They wait. They allow you to approach them on their terms, slowly, thoughtfully, without urgency. As night settles in and the world grows quieter, it becomes easier to imagine the Olmecs as they once were, not as an abstract civilization, but as people moving through torchlit plazas, listening to drums echo through the trees, watching the stars reflect in river water. It becomes easier to accept that history is not just a record of events, but a collection of lives lived fully and then released. This journey into their world, their rise, their beliefs, and their gentle fading does not begin with dates or timelines. It begins with a face emerging from the earth, asking a simple, unsettling question without words. How much of human history has already been forgotten? And as that question lingers unanswered, we slowly drift backward in time, toward the rivers, the forests, and the first quiet steps of a civilization that would shape an entire continent, and then slip into sleep beneath the soil. To understand how the Olmecs could emerge at all, the mind must first settle into a world that existed before them, a world shaped not by stone monuments or carved faces, but by water, soil, and endless green. Long before cities or rulers, the land itself set the rhythm of life. The Gulf Coast of what is now southern Mexico was warm, humid, and alive in a way that feels almost overwhelming to imagine. Rain fell often, rivers swelled and retreated with the seasons, and the air carried the deep, constant breath of the jungle. This was not an easy place to live. The ground was soft and unpredictable, turning to thick mud after heavy rains. Insects filled the air, and unseen animals moved through the undergrowth. Yet it was also a land of abundance. Rivers carried fish. Forests provided fruit, roots, and game. Floodplains renewed themselves year after year, leaving behind rich soil that could sustain crops. Life here required patience, observation, and a deep understanding of natural cycles. As the sun rose each morning, mist drifted low over the water, blurring the line between land and river. Sounds traveled differently in this world. Bird calls echoed through the trees, water lapped gently against riverbanks, and the wind moved leaves in long, whispering waves. It was a landscape that invited attention, that taught its inhabitants to listen more than they spoke. For the people who lived here thousands of years ago, survival depended on reading subtle signs. The timing of rains, the behavior of animals, the slow changes in river currents. These were not background details, but vital information passed from one generation to the next. Knowledge was not written down. It was carried in memory, in stories told beside cooking fires, in habits formed through repetition and care. Small communities settled near waterways, building homes from wood, reeds, and earth. These structures left little trace, blending back into the land when abandoned. Life moved at a pace set by daylight and weather rather than by clocks or calendars. Days were filled with work that connected the body directly to the land, planting, harvesting, fishing, shaping tools from stone and bone. Evenings brought rest, shared meals, and the quiet comfort of familiarity. Over time, people began to shape the environment in small but meaningful ways. They cleared patches of forest to plant crops like maize, beans, and squash, plants that would become central to life across Mesoamerica. They learned how to manage water, guiding it rather than resisting it, allowing floods to enrich the soil instead of destroying it. These early acts of cooperation with nature laid the groundwork for something larger. The rivers, especially, played a central role. They were highways of movement, carrying people, goods, and ideas across long distances. Canoes slipped quietly over the water's surface, connecting communities that might otherwise have remained isolated. Along these routes, people exchanged tools, food, and stories. Over generations, shared customs and beliefs began to form, knitting separate groups into broader cultural networks. At night, the sky above the jungle revealed itself in moments between clouds. Stars appeared, reflected faintly in dark water. Without artificial light, the heavens felt closer, more immediate. Patterns in the sky became part of how people understood time and direction. The movements of celestial bodies were noticed not out of abstract curiosity, but because they mirrored the rhythms of life on the ground: growth, decay, return. There was no clear boundary between the natural and the spiritual. The forest was not simply a collection of trees. It was alive, aware, filled with unseen forces. Animals were not just prey or danger, but fellow inhabitants of a shared world. Certain places, river bends, caves, hills, carried a sense of presence, as if something lingered there beyond human sight. These feelings did not need explanation. They were accepted as part reality. As generations passed, communities grew more stable. Seasonal camps became permanent villages. Relationships deepened, and with them came new forms of leadership. Not yet kings or elites, but respected figures who guided decisions and mediated conflicts. Authority emerged through trust, experience, and ritual rather than force. Cooperation was essential. No one survived alone in such an environment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, complexity began to build. Specialized skills developed as some individuals focused more on crafting tools, shaping clay, or observing natural patterns. Others became known for their ability to heal, to interpret dreams, or to communicate with the unseen aspects of the world. These roles added layers to social life, creating a sense of structure without rigid hierarchy. What is striking about this period is how little it announces itself in the archaeological record. There are no sudden leaps, no dramatic revolutions. Change happens gradually, carried forward by countless small decisions made in response to the land. It is easy to overlook such a beginning, to dismiss it as simple or primitive, but in reality, it represents a profound form of intelligence, one rooted in balance rather than domination. This world, shaped by water and forest, taught its inhabitants how to endure. It rewarded attentiveness and punished carelessness. Over time, it fostered a mindset capable of long-term planning, collective effort, and symbolic thought. The seeds of future cities were not planted in stone, but in shared understanding. When the Olmecs would eventually rise, they did not do so in defiance of this landscape. They emerged from it, carrying forward generations of accumulated knowledge. Their cities, their rituals, and even their monumental art will reflect the environment that shaped them. The calm expressions carved into stone centuries later echo the patience required to live here, the acceptance of cycles beyond human control. As the jungle breathed in the night, as rivers continued their slow, steady movement toward the sea, the stage was quietly set. Nothing dramatic marked the transition from this ancient world to the beginnings of civilization. There was no single moment of awakening, no clear dividing line. There was only continuity, life adapting, learning, and deepening its relationship with the land. And in that continuity, beneath the vast sky and among the whispering trees, the conditions were forming for something remarkable, a culture that would one day move mountains of stone, shape the beliefs of an entire region, and leave behind faces that still watch the world in silence. For now, though, the land remained in control, guiding its people gently, patiently, toward a future they could not yet imagine. Before the Olmecs became a civilization that could be recognized in stone and earth, there was a much quieter story unfolding, one without monuments, without names, without any clear beginning. It was a story shaped by repetition rather than revolution, by countless small choices made over generations. These early communities did not know they were laying foundations for something enduring. They were simply living, adapting, and remembering what worked. Families gathered near rivers and streams, drawn by reliable water and fertile soil. The rivers were more than resources. They were companions that changed with the seasons, sometimes generous, sometimes destructive. People learned to read their moods. A swollen river meant danger, but also promise, as floodwaters left behind rich layers of silt. Knowledge of when to plant and when to wait became a form of wisdom passed quietly from elders to children. Life was structured around cooperation. Survival depended on shared effort, clearing land, planting crops, building shelters, and protecting one another from the uncertainties of the environment. There was no room for isolation. Every task, no matter how small, contributed to the group's well-being. Over time, this reliance on community fostered a deep sense of belonging and responsibility. Tools were simple but effective. Stone blades, wooden digging sticks, baskets woven from plant fibers. Each object reflected intimate knowledge of local materials. There was care in their making, not just efficiency. A well-crafted tool was valued not only for what it could do, but for how long it could last. Repair was as important as creation, reinforcing a mindset that favored preservation over excess. Food was central to daily life, and its acquisition shaped routines and relationships. Hunting required patience and coordination. Fishing demanded an understanding of currents and seasonal patterns. Farming, still in its early stages, tied people to land in new ways. Crops like maize did not simply provide calories. They required planning, timing, and trust in the future. Planting a seed meant believing that you would be there to harvest it months later. This shift toward agriculture subtly changed how people thought about time. Life was no longer only about the immediate present. It became cyclical, marked by planting and harvesting, by preparation and waiting. The past mattered because it held lessons. The future mattered because it promised return. This growing awareness of cycles would later become a defining feature of Mesoamerican cultures. As settlements became more permanent, relationships between families deepened. Marriages connected groups, creating networks of kinship that extended beyond a single village. With these connections came shared traditions, rituals, and stories. Even without writing, memory was carefully maintained through repetition. Songs, myths, and oral histories preserved knowledge in forms that could be easily remembered and passed on. Spiritual life was woven seamlessly into everyday existence. There was no clear separation between the sacred and the ordinary. The success of a hunt, the growth of crops, the health of children, all were seen as connected to forces beyond human control. People did not seek to dominate these forces, but to live in harmony with them. Simple offerings, gestures of respect, and communal rituals expressed gratitude and hope. Certain individuals began to stand out, not through wealth or coercion, but through skill and insight. Some were known for their ability to heal using plants and observation. Others were gifted storytellers, capable of holding a community's attention and reinforcing shared values. Still others showed a talent for organizing work or resolving disputes. Leadership emerged naturally, grounded in trust rather than authority. Over generations, these informal roles became more defined. The seeds of social differentiation were planted, though still far from rigid class structures. Respect was earned and could be lost. Influence was fluid, responding to circumstances rather than fixed positions. This flexibility allowed communities to adapt to change without breaking apart. Trade began in modest ways. Surplus goods, extra crops, finely made tools, decorative objects, were exchanged with neighboring groups. These interactions expanded horizons, introducing new materials and ideas. A stone unlike any found locally might carry stories of distant lands. Such exchanges fostered curiosity and a growing awareness of a wider world beyond the immediate landscape. With trade came comparison. People noticed differences in customs, tools, and beliefs. Some practices spread because they worked better, others because they carried symbolic meaning. Gradually, shared cultural patterns emerged across regions, binding separate communities into broader traditions. These shared elements did not erase local identities, but enriched them. What is remarkable about this period is how stable it was. There were challenges, droughts, floods, conflicts, but communities endured by adapting rather than collapsing. Change was incremental, almost invisible when viewed from within. It is only in hindsight that we recognize how transformative this era truly was. The absence of monumental architecture or written records has often led to underestimation of these early societies. Yet their achievements were profound. They developed sustainable ways of living in a demanding environment. They created social systems based on cooperation and mutual support. They nurtured symbolic thinking that allowed them to make sense of a complex world. As time passed, population gradually increased. Villages expanded, and some became central places where people gathered for rituals, trade, and decision-making. These hubs were not yet cities, but they hinted at what was to come. The idea that a place could hold special significance beyond daily survival began to take root. Children grew up in this world learning not only practical skills, but also how to interpret signs and stories. They learned which plants healed and which harmed, which animals were respected and which feared. They learned to listen to elders of the land, to the quiet messages carried by wind and water. This attentiveness shaped their understanding of reality. By the time the first unmistakable signs of Olmec culture appeared, the groundwork had long been laid. There was already a shared way of seeing the world, a deep familiarity with cycles of nature, and a capacity for collective effort. The emergence of large ceremonial centers and monumental art would not be a sudden leap, but a natural extension of patterns established over centuries. In this sense, the Olmecs were not an abrupt beginning, but a culmination. They were the visible expression of countless unseen lives lived with care and continuity. The people who came before them may never have imagined colossal stone heads or planned cities, but their choices made such things possible. As the forest continued its slow growth and rivers followed their ancient paths, these early communities carried on, unaware that history would one day look back and see in the quiet origins of one of the most influential civilizations in the Americas. Their story reminds us that greatness often begins not with spectacle, but with patience, cooperation, and the steady accumulation of wisdom over time. There comes a moment in deep time when gradual change becomes something recognizable, when the quiet patterns of daily life begin to arrange themselves into forms that feel deliberate and lasting. For the people of the Gulf Coast, that moment did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself with dramatic gestures. Instead, it unfolded like dawn, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the world looked different than it had before. Villages were no longer just places to live. They became centers of meaning. Communities that had once functioned independently began to align themselves around shared spaces. These were places set apart from ordinary life, where rituals were performed, decisions were made, and the unseen forces of the world were acknowledged. Earth was moved, shaped, and layered with intention. Platforms rose from the ground, not as defensive structures, but as stages for ceremony and gathering. For the first time, the landscape itself began to reflect human ideas. This was the emergence of something new, a civilization not defined by conquests or walls, but by organization, symbolism, and collective purpose. The people we now call the Olmecs did not invent civilization from nothing. They refined it. They gathered together threads that had been developing for centuries and wove them into a more complex pattern. Leadership changed during this time. Influence was no longer held only by elders or skilled individuals within small communities. It began to concentrate in figures who embodied both political and spiritual authority. These leaders were not distant rulers issuing commands from fortified palaces. They were deeply connected to ritual, believed to stand at the threshold between the human world and the forces that govern nature and fate. Power, in this early civilization, was quiet but unmistakable. It showed itself in the ability to mobilize people for large projects, to coordinate labor across seasons, and to maintain stability over long periods. It was expressed through ceremony, symbolism, and the careful shaping of space. To build with earth and stone required more than strength. It required shared belief. The rise of ceremonial centers marked a turning point. These places drew people from surrounding regions, creating a sense of shared identity that extended beyond kinship ties. Pilgrimages, festivals, and rituals reinforced connections between communities, weaving them into a broader cultural fabric. Participation in these gatherings strengthened social bonds and affirmed common values. With this expansion came increased specialization. Some individuals focused more heavily on crafting objects of ritual significance, carved stone, finely shaped figurines, carefully prepared offerings. Others became responsible for maintaining calendars of seasons and ceremonies, observing the movement of the sun and stars. Knowledge became more layered, more guarded, and more powerful. The Olmecs began to express their worldview through imagery that was both symbolic and deeply emotional. Figures carved in stone or shaped from clay often blended human and animal traits, suggesting transformation rather than separation. These images were not decorative. They carried meaning understood by those who live within the culture, reinforcing ideas about power, identity, and the nature of existence. It is during this period that we see the earliest signs of monumental ambition. Stone was quarried, transported, and shaped with astonishing precision. The effort required suggests not only technical skill, but a society capable of long-term planning and coordination. These projects were not undertaken lightly. They were acts of devotion, statement of presence, and anchors for memory. Yet even as complexity increased, daily life remained closely tied to the land. Farming continued to shape routines, and success still depended on understanding weather, soil, and water. Civilization did not replace nature. It existed within it. This balance may explain the resilience of Olmec society during its early growth. Change did not erase tradition. It built upon it. Trade networks expanded significantly during this time. Materials not found locally, jade, obsidian, and other valuable stones, appeared in Olmec centers. These objects traveled long distances, passing through many hands before reaching their destinations. Their presence indicates not only economic exchange, but shared symbolic values across regions. As ideas and materials flowed in and out, Olmec culture began to exert a quiet influence on neighboring peoples. Symbols, artistic styles, and ritual practices spread, sometimes adopted fully, sometimes adapted to local traditions. This influence was not imposed. It moved along pathways of respect, curiosity, and shared understanding. What makes this civilization remarkable is how early it emerged. While other parts of the world were still experimenting with agriculture or small settlements, the Olmecs were organizing complex societies with centralized ceremonial spaces and shared cosmologies. They did so without writing, without metal tools, and without animals to pull heavy loads. Their achievements challenge assumptions about what is required for civilization to take shape. Despite the sophistication, there is little evidence of large-scale warfare during the early Olmec period. Defensive structures are rare, and imagery focused on conflict is minimal. This suggests that stability was maintained through social cohesion rather than force. Authority was reinforced through ritual and shared belief, creating a sense of order that did not rely on constant violence. The development of a shared cosmology played a crucial role in this process. Stories about the origins of the world, the movement of celestial bodies, and the relationship between humans and gods provided a framework for understanding existence. These narratives help people make sense of uncertainty and change, offering comfort and guidance in a complex world. As generations passed, children were born into a society that already felt established. Ceremonial centers had histories. Rituals had prescribed forms. Symbols carried layers of meaning accumulated over time. For these children, civilization was not an experiment. It was simply the way the world was. And yet, beneath this sense of permanence lay the same forces that had always shaped human life. Floods still came. Drought still tested resilience. The forest continued its slow growth, reclaiming abandoned spaces if vigilance waned. The Olmecs did not escape these realities. They learned to navigate them within a more complex social framework. Looking back, it is tempting to mark this moment as the clear beginning of civilization in Mesoamerica. But from within, it likely felt like continuity rather than rupture. Life still followed familiar rhythms. People still rose with the sun and rested after dusk. What had changed was scale, of cooperation, of imagination, of memory. The Olmecs became the first civilization of Mesoamerica, not because they sought that distinction, but because their way of life reached a level of integration and expression that left lasting traces. Their cities, their art, and their ideas would echo through time, shaping cultures that followed. This was the point at which the quiet groundwork of earlier generations transformed into something visible and enduring. The land bore the marks of human intention, and those marks would not fade quickly. Civilization had taken root, gently but firmly, in the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast, setting in motion a story that would unfold over centuries, long after its originators had returned to the earth. At some point, the landscape itself began to change in ways that could no longer be mistaken for chance. The flat, humid lowlands where rivers braided through swamps and forests slowly took on a new shape, guided by human hands and human intention. Earth was moved, not hastily or violently, but patiently, layer by layer. What emerged from this effort was not just a settlement, but a statement. San Lorenzo was coming into being. It did not rise like the stone cities of later centuries, nor did it announce itself with towering walls. Instead, it grew outward and upward from a natural plateau, subtly elevated above the surrounding floodplains. This choice alone reveals deep understanding. The people who shaped San Lorenzo knew the moods of the rivers and the dangers of seasonal flooding. By lifting their ceremonial and residential spaces above the wetlands, they created a place of stability in an otherwise shifting environment. The transformation of the land required coordination on a scale previously unseen in the region. Tons of earth were moved to level surfaces and create terraces. Drainage systems were carefully designed, channeling rainwater away from important areas and preventing erosion. These were not crude solutions. They reflected careful planning, observation, and experience passed down through generations. Water, always central to life along the Gulf Coast, was given special attention at San Lorenzo. Stone-lined channels directed its flow with precision, suggesting not only practical concerns, but symbolic ones as well. Water was life, movement, and renewal. To control, it was not merely an engineering achievement. It was a reflection of authority and harmony with the natural world. As San Lorenzo grew, it became a focal point for surrounding communities. People traveled there not only to trade or work, but participate in rituals that reaffirmed shared beliefs. The city's layout encouraged gathering, guiding movement through open spaces and raised platforms. These areas were designed to be seen, to be experienced collectively, reinforcing a sense of unity. Residences near the ceremonial core were larger and more refined, indicating the presence of an elite class. These were likely the leaders whose faces would later be immortalized in stone. Their proximity to ritual spaces suggests that political power and spiritual authority were deeply intertwined. To lead was to mediate between the human and the sacred. Yet even within this growing center of power, daily life remained grounded. Beyond the core, ordinary homes clustered in patterns shaped by family ties and practical needs. People cooked, crafted, and rested as they always had, their routines shaped by daylight and season. The city did not erase tradition. It organized it. The most striking feature of San Lorenzo, the one that continues to capture the imagination, is its monumental stone sculpture. Colossal heads began to appear, carved from massive basalt boulders transported from distant mountains. The journey alone was an extraordinary feat without wheels or draft animals. These stones were moved across rivers and through dense terrain, guided by human strength and ingenuity. Carving these heads required not only skill, but vision. Each face is distinct, with unique features that suggest individual identities rather than generic symbols. The expressions are calm, almost introspective, as if aware of their role as witnesses rather than performers. They do not dominate the space with aggression. They occupy it with presence. These sculptures were likely positioned with intention, placed in locations that frame movement and ceremony. They watched over plazas and pathways, reminding all who passed of the authority embedded in the city. In a world without written laws, such visual statements carried immense weight. San Lorenzo's influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Through trade networks, its ideas, symbols, and practices traveled across the region. Objects crafted in its style appeared in distant communities, signaling connection and admiration. This was not the spread of empire, but of culture, a quiet expansion of influence grounded in shared values. The city reached its height between roughly 1200 and 900 BC, a period of remarkable stability and productivity. During this time, San Lorenzo was not just a political center, but a place of innovation. Artistic techniques refined here would shape Mesoamerican aesthetics for centuries. Religious concepts developed here would echo through later mythologies. And yet, beneath this apparent permanence, change was already stirring. The same rivers that nourished San Lorenzo could also threaten it. Shifts in water flow, changes in climate, or alterations in surrounding environment may have disrupted the delicate balance that sustained the city. There's evidence that monuments were moved, reworked, or deliberately buried, actions that suggest transition rather than destruction. Unlike many later cities, San Lorenzo does not appear to have fallen to invasion or violent collapse. Its decline was measured, almost respectful. As power shifted elsewhere, the city's central role faded. People moved on, carrying their knowledge and beliefs with them. The earthworks remained, slowly softening under rain and vegetation. This gentle decline is part of what makes San Lorenzo so compelling. It reminds us that even the most carefully planned centers are subject to forces beyond control. Human achievement, no matter how impressive, exists within a larger natural rhythm. When the city was eventually abandoned, it did not vanish completely. Its influence lived on in memory and tradition, shaping the rise of new centers like La Venta. The lessons learned here about organization, symbolism, and leadership were not lost. They were transformed. Standing in the imagined stillness of San Lorenzo's plazas, one can almost hear echoes of its past. The sound of water moving through channels, the low murmur of voices during ceremonies, the quiet labor of people shaping earth and stone with purpose. It was a city born not of conquest, but cooperation, rising patiently from the swamps through shared belief. San Lorenzo represents the moment when Olmec civilization first took a clearly defined form. It was where ideas became architecture, where authority found expression in landscape and art. Though its time at the center was brief in the span of history, its impact was profound. In its careful design and measured decline, San Lorenzo offers a lesson as relevant now as it was thousands of years ago. Civilization is not only about building high or lasting long. It is about understanding place, honoring balance, and knowing when to let go. To stand before one of the colossal stone faces is to feel washed across time. The surface of basalt is worn smooth in places, rough in others, bearing the quiet scars of centuries spent under open sky, an encroaching earth. These faces do not shout their power. They do not exaggerate emotion or gesture. Instead, they remain still, grounded, and composed, as if they were carved not to impress, but to endure. Each head is unmistakably human. The broad noses, full lips, and heavy-lidded eyes are not idealized or abstract. They feel specific, personal, almost intimate. This is not the art of anonymous gods or mythical beings. It is the art of recognition. The people who carved these monuments were preserving something they believed mattered deeply: identity, authority, memory. Most scholars now believe these faces represent rulers, leaders who held both political and spiritual significance. In Olmec society, leadership was not separated into neat categories. The one who governed was also the one who mediated between worlds, who understood the rhythms of nature and the will of unseen forces. To rule was not simply command, but to embody balance. The helmets or headdresses worn by these figures hint at their roles. They resemble protective gear, perhaps worn during ritual ball games or ceremonial events. This detail suggests that leadership involved participation, visibility, and risk. These were not distant figures hidden behind walls. They were present, known, and seen by their people. The sheer effort required to create these sculptures speaks volumes about the authority of those they depict. Transporting massive basalt boulders across miles of challenging terrain would have demanded the coordinated labor of many. Such an undertaking would not have been possible without widespread support and shared belief in the importance of the project. These were not vanity monuments. They were communal acts of remembrance. What is striking is the absence of overt aggression. There are no raised weapons, no expressions of fury or domination. The power conveyed is calm and assured. This suggests a form of leadership rooted in stability rather than fear. The ruler's strength lay in their connection to tradition, ritual, and the collective identity of the community. In a world without writing, images carried the weight of record and law. A colossal head placed at a ceremonial center would have been a constant reminder of continuity. It told people who had guided them, who had protected them, and who remained present even after death. Stone became a substitute for written memory. These rulers were likely believed to maintain influence beyond their lifetimes. Death did not sever their connection to the living community. By carving their likeness into enduring material, the Olmecs ensured that their leaders remained part of the landscape itself. The face did not merely represent a person. It anchored their presence in the physical world. Leadership in Olmec society also carried profound responsibility. Maintaining harmony between human activity and natural forces was essential. Crop failures, floods, or droughts could be interpreted as signs of imbalance. The ruler, as mediator, bore the weight of these outcomes. Success reinforced legitimacy. Failure threatened it. This may explain why some monuments were reworked or relocated. When a ruler's influence waned or when circumstances changed, their image might be altered, moved, or even buried. These actions were not acts of destruction, but of transition. They acknowledged that power was not fixed. It evolved with time and circumstance. The faces themselves reveal subtle individuality. Differences in facial structure, expression, and adornment suggest that each head was carved to resemble a specific person. This attention to detail reflects a society that valued personal legacy. Leaders were remembered not just for their role, but for who they were. Imagining these rulers as living figures adds depth to the stone. They would have walked through plazas, participated in rituals, listened to counsel, and made decisions that affected thousands. They experienced doubt, hope, and responsibility. The calm expressions carved into stone may reflect an idealized vision of leadership, composed, steady, and enduring. Their authority was reinforced through ceremony. Public rituals would have gathered communities together, reaffirming shared beliefs and social order. Music, movement, and offerings transformed abstract ideas into lived experience. In these moments, the ruler's role as mediator was made visible and tangible. The relationship between ruler and people was likely reciprocal. Support flowed upward through labor and loyalty, while guidance and protection flowed downward through ritual and organization. This balance sustained social cohesion and allowed large-scale projects to proceed without constant coercion. Over time, the memory of these rulers became layered. New leaders emerged and new monuments were carved. Yet the old faces remained, watching silently as generations passed. They formed a lineage of presence, linking past and present in stone. It is possible that children grew up seeing these heads as part of the natural world. They would have learned the stories associated with each face, absorbing lessons about leadership, responsibility, and continuity. The monuments were not relics. They were active participants in cultural life. Today, separated from their original context, these faces can seem enigmatic. But within Olmec society, their meaning would have been clear and powerful. They were anchors of identity, embodiments of authority, and reminders of the human effort required to sustain civilization. There's a quiet dignity in their survival. While cities rose and fell, while rituals changed and languages disappeared, these faces remained. They endured storms, floods, and the slow encroachment of vegetation. They waited. In their silence, they invite reflection. They ask us to consider how power is remembered, how leadership is defined, and what it means to leave a mark that outlasts a lifetime. The Olmec rulers behind these stone faces understood that memory, once shaped into stone, becomes part of the world itself. As night falls in the imagined plazas of ancient cities, the faces would have caught the fading light, their expressions unchanged. They watched over a society that trusted them, guided them, and eventually moved on. And even now, thousands of years later, they continue to watch, reminding us of human stories, when carved with care and belief, can transcend time. Beyond the ceremonial centers and the imposing presence of carved stone, life for most Olmec people unfolded in quiet, familiar rhythms. Away from plazas and rituals, the heart of society beat in small homes clustered near fields and waterways, where daily routines shaped both survival and identity. These moments, repeated day after day, formed the foundation upon which everything else rested. As the sun rose, light filtered through layers of leaves, casting shifting patterns on packed earth floors. Smoke drifted upward from hearth fires as meals were prepared, the scent of maize and gathered plants mixing with damp air. Mornings were a time of purpose. Fields needed tending, tools needed repair, children needed guidance. Work began early, guided by the movement of the sun rather than by any fixed measure of time. Farming was central to life, but it was not the only concern. Maize, beans, and squash formed the core of the diet, grown together in ways that supported both soil and plant health. This system, refined through generations of observation, reflected a deep understanding of ecological balance. Fields were not exploited until exhaustion. They were cared for, allowed to rest, and nurtured back to productivity. Fishing and hunting supplemented agricultural life, adding variety and resilience. Rivers provided fish, turtle, and waterfowl, while forests offered deer, small mammals, and birds. Hunting required patience and respect. Animals were not taken casually. Their capture was often accompanied by rituals that acknowledged the exchange between human and natural worlds. Craftsmanship filled the spaces between subsistence tasks. Stone tools were shaped with careful strikes, their edges honed for efficiency and durability. Clay was gathered and transformed into vessels for cooking and storage, each piece shaped by hand and fired with care. Even ordinary objects carried subtle variations that reflected individual skill and creativity. Textiles and baskets were woven from plant fibers, their patterns both functional and expressive. These items supported daily life, but they also communicated identity. The way a basket was woven or a garment was decorated could signal family, region, or role within the community. Beauty and usefulness were not separate concepts. They flowed together naturally. Children learned by watching and doing. There were no formal schools, but education was constant. Young hands mimicked older ones, guided gently through repetition. Stories told in the evenings carried lessons about the world, about behavior, and about the unseen forces that shaped existence. Memory was trained through listening, observation, and participation. Social life was deeply communal. Tasks were often shared, and success depended on cooperation. Harvest brought people together, as did the construction of homes or the clearing of fields. These moments reinforced bonds, creating a sense of shared accomplishment and mutual reliance. Conflict, when it arose, was managed through discussion and mediation rather than force. Food was prepared and eaten together whenever possible. Meals were moments of connection, where stories were exchanged and relationships reaffirmed. The act of sharing food reinforced trust and belonging. Even scarcity was faced collectively, with resources distributed to ensure survival. Spiritual belief was woven seamlessly into these routines. There was no sharp boundary between sacred and mundane. The planting of seeds, the shaping of clay, the preparation of food, all carried symbolic meaning. Simple gestures of respect, offerings, or quiet words acknowledged the presence of forces beyond human control. Seasonal changes brought variation to daily life. The rainy season altered routines, requiring adjustments in work and movement. Floods could isolate communities temporarily, turning familiar paths into waterways. During these times, adaptability was essential. People learned to read the land signals and respond with flexibility rather than resistance. Music and sound played subtle roles in everyday life. Simple instruments, voices, and rhythmic movements accompanied rituals and celebrations. These sounds reinforced community identity and provided comfort. Even the natural soundscape, the rustle of leaves, the call of birds, the steady flow of water, became part of shared sensory experience. Despite the presence of social distinctions, life remained relatively egalitarian for most. While elites lived closer to ceremonial centers, ordinary people were not excluded from ritual life. Participation in communal events reinforced a sense of inclusion. Authority was visible, but not oppressive. Health and healing were addressed through knowledge of plants, observation, and ritual. Illness was understood as both physical and spiritual imbalance. Healers used a combination of practical remedies and symbolic acts to restore harmony. Care for the sick was a communal responsibility, reflecting deep social bonds. As night approached, activity slowed. Fires were tended, and families gathered close. The darkness brought a different awareness of the world. Sounds carried farther, shadows deepened, and the presence of unseen forces felt closer. Stories took on greater significance, linking listeners to ancestors and shared history. Sleep itself was a communal experience. Homes were simple, and families rested together, finding comfort in proximity. Dreams were not dismissed as meaningless. They were often shared and discussed, seen as messages or reflections of deeper truths. Through these daily rhythms, Olmec society sustained itself. There was no constant awareness of participating in something historically significant. Life was lived in the present, shaped by habit and care. And yet, it was precisely this consistency that allowed the civilization to flourish. The quiet strength of Olmec culture lay not only in its monuments or rulers, but in these ordinary moments repeated over generations. The patience required to tend fields, the skill to craft tools, the empathy to care for one another. These were the true foundations of their world. In the end, it was this everyday life, lived beneath the canopy and beside the rivers, that made everything else possible. Without it, there would have been no cities, no rituals, no stone faces watching across time. Civilization did not float above the people. It grew from their hands, their routines, and their shared understanding of how to live together in a demanding but generous land. As the Olmec world grew more complex, so too did the invisible threads that held it together. Beyond the routines of farming and craft, beyond leadership and community, there existed a deeper layer of meaning that shaped how people understood everything around them. This was a world where the sacred was not distant or abstract, but immediate, felt in the soil beneath bare feet, in the blood that pulsed through the body, and in the silence that followed ritual acts. For the Olmecs, the universe was alive with forces that could not always be seen, but were always present. Mountains, rivers, animals, storms, and even certain objects carried spiritual weight. These forces were not separate from daily life. They moved through it, influencing health, harvests, and fate. To live well was to remain in balance with them. Ritual was a language through which this balance was maintained. It was not reserved for rare occasions alone, but woven into the fabric of existence. Some rituals were communal, performed at ceremonial centers where large groups gathered. Others were private, carried out within families or by individuals seeking guidance or healing. Each act, no matter how small, carried intention. Blood held particular significance. It was seen as a powerful substance, a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms. To offer blood was to offer life itself, a gesture of profound respect and devotion. These acts were not casual or frequent, but deeply meaningful, performed at moments of transition, crisis, or renewal. The shedding of blood was believed to nourish the unseen forces that sustained the world. Those who performed these rituals often entered altered states of awareness. Through fasting, rhythm, chanting, or the use of natural substances, they crossed the threshold between ordinary perception and something deeper. In these moments, the boundaries between human and divine blurred. Visions, dreams, and sensations carried messages that guided decisions and reinforced belief. Certain individuals were especially skilled in navigating this liminal space. These were the shamans, figures who moved between worlds with practiced ease. They healed, interpreted signs, and communicated with spirits on behalf of the community. Their authority did not come from force, but from trust in their ability to see what others could not. The Olmec spiritual world was populated by beings that defy simple categorization. Deities were not always clearly defined personalities with fixed stories. Instead, they were forces embodied through symbols and hybrid forms. Human figures merged with animals, especially creatures associated with power and transformation. These images reflected a belief that identity was fluid, capable of shifting between states. Ritual spaces were designed to enhance these experiences. Platforms, mounds, and plazas were not merely architectural features. They were stages for interaction between worlds. Movement through these spaces followed symbolic paths, guiding participants through acts of separation, transformation, and return. The physical journey mirrored the spiritual one. Offerings played a central role in ritual life. Objects of value, jade, finely crafted figurines, food, and other materials, were given not as sacrifices born of fear, but as gestures of reciprocity. The Olmecs believed that the world functioned through exchange. Humans took from the land, and in return, they offer respect and nourishment to forces that sustained it. Burial practices reveal much about these beliefs. The dead were not simply disposed of. They were placed carefully, often with objects meant to accompany them beyond life. Death was not seen as an ending, but as a transition. Ancestors remained part of the community. Their presence felt in dreams, memory, and ritual. The concept of transformation lay at the heart of Olmec spirituality. Just as maize transformed from seed to plant to food, humans were believed to move through different states of being. Life, death, and rebirth formed a continuous cycle. This understanding softened the fear of endings, replacing it with acceptance of change. Ceremonial events often align with natural cycles. Seasonal changes, celestial movements, agricultural milestones. These moments were seen as points of heightened energy, when the boundary between worlds was thinner. Participation in ritual during these times reinforced communal identity and shared purpose. Sound and movement were essential components of these ceremonies. Drumming, chanting, and rhythmic motion altered perception, drawing participants into a collective experience. In these moments, individual identity dissolved into something larger. The community moved and breathed as one, reinforcing social bonds and shared belief. Symbols carved into stone or shaped from clay served as visual anchors for these ideas. They reminded people of stories, forces, and relationships that could not be fully expressed in words. Over time, these symbols became part of shared visual language, understood intuitively by those within the culture. The spiritual worldview of the Olmecs did not demand blind obedience. It invited participation. People learned through experience, through observation, through feeling. Belief was reinforced not by doctrine, but by lived reality, by moments when ritual seemed to work, when harmony was restored, when life continued. This system also provided a framework for understanding suffering and uncertainty. Illness, crop failure, or natural disaster were not random. They were signs of imbalance, calls for reflection and action. Ritual offered a way to respond, to regain a sense of agency in a world that could otherwise feel unpredictable. Importantly, spirituality did not exist apart from leadership. Rulers were deeply involved in ritual life, their authority reinforced through the perceived connection to the sacred. Their ability to maintain balance between worlds legitimized their position. Failure to do so could weaken their standing. As generations passed, these beliefs became deeply ingrained. Children grew up watching rituals, hearing stories, and learning symbols. Spiritual understanding was absorbed gradually, becoming part of how people perceive reality itself. There was no moment when belief began. It simply was. In the quiet hours of night, when fires burned low and the jungle hummed with unseen life, the spiritual presence of the world felt closest. Dreams took on significance. Silence carried meaning. The sense that one was never truly alone brought both comfort and responsibility. This sacred worldview shaped every aspect of Olmec civilization. It guided art, architecture, leadership, and daily life. It provided coherence in a complex world and continuity across generations. Even as cities changed and centers of power shifted, these beliefs endured, adapting without losing their core. Though much has been lost to time, the echoes of Olmec spirituality remain. They linger in the symbols adopted by later cultures, in the emphasis on cycles and transformation that would define Mesoamerican thought. They remind us that for the Olmecs, civilization was not just about building and organizing. It was about understanding one's place in a living universe and honoring that connection through acts of devotion, balance, and care. And in that understanding, carried quietly through ritual and blood, through symbol and silence, the Olmecs found meaning that reached far beyond their own time. In the deep forests and river valleys of the Olmec world, there was an animal that commanded a different kind of attention. It did not need to be named aloud to be understood. Its presence was felt in the hush that followed its movement, in the tension of the air when night settled fully over the land. The jaguar was not simply a creature among others. It was a force, a boundary crosser, a being that seemed to exist in more than one realm at once. The jaguar moved with a silence that felt unnatural, appearing and disappearing as though the forest itself were breathing it in and out. Its strength was undeniable, yet it did not rely on constant display. It waited, watched, and chose its moment. To the Olmecs, this behavior was not merely animal instinct. It was a lesson. Power did not need to announce itself. True power was patient. Unlike animals that lived in groups, the jaguar was solitary. It did not depend on others for survival. It walked its own path, unseen and unchallenged. This solitude carried spiritual meaning. The jaguar was associated with those who could move alone between worlds, shamans, rulers, and beings that did not fully belong to the human realm. To embody the jaguar was to accept isolation in exchange for deeper understanding. The jaguar was also a creature of thresholds. It hunted at dusk and dawn, times when day and night blurred into one another. It swam effortlessly across rivers and climbed trees with ease, mastering spaces that humans found difficult or dangerous. This ability to move freely between environments reinforced its role as a symbol of transformation. It belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. For the Olmecs, the world itself was layered. There was the visible world of people, plants, and animals. Beneath it lay an underworld of water, darkness, and ancestors. Above it stretched the sky, home to celestial forces and cycles. The jaguar moved between these layers with ease. It hunted on land, swam in water, and vanished into darkness. In doing so, it became the perfect symbol of a being that could traverse all realms. This belief found expression in Olmec art. Stone carvings and figurines began to show human figures with jaguar traits: slanted eyes, fangs, clawed hands, or feline mouths. These were not monsters meant to frighten. They were hybrids, expressions of transition rather than division. They suggested that the boundary between human and animal was not fixed, but permeable. The so-called word jaguar figure appears again and again. Its features both human and feline. Some scholars interpret this imagery as mythological, others as symbolic of ritual transformation. From within the Olmec worldview, the distinction may not have mattered. To them, transformation was real, experienced through ritual, vision, and belief. The image captured a truth they felt rather than a story they told. The jaguar was often associated with rain and fertility. Its spotted coat mirrored the pattern of raindrops falling on earth. Its roar echoed thunder in the distance. In a land where agriculture depended on rainfall, this connection held immense importance. To honor the jaguar was to honor the forces that sustain life. Rulers and shamans likely invoked jaguar symbolism to legitimize their authority. By aligning themselves with the jaguar, they signaled their ability to move beyond ordinary human limits. This was not arrogance, but responsibility. To take on the jaguar's qualities meant accepting the burden of mediation between worlds. Jaguar imagery also carried a darker, more complex meaning. As a predator, the jaguar reminded people of death's presence within life. It killed to survive, maintaining balance within the ecosystem. This role was not viewed as cruel, but necessary. Death was not an enemy, but a transformation. The jaguar embodied this truth without apology. Children growing up in Olmec communities would have learned about the jaguar early. Stories shared at night, gestures of caution during hunts, and symbolic objects reinforced its significance. Fear and reverence coexisted. The jaguar was respected not because it was gentle, but because it was powerful and unpredictable. Rituals likely incorporated jaguar elements through masks, costumes, or symbolic objects. By wearing the jaguar's likeness, participants did not pretend to become animals. They allowed the jaguar's qualities to move through them. Strength, vision, and connection to the unseen were temporarily borrowed, experienced, and then released. The jaguar's association with night deepened its spiritual role. Night was not merely darkness. It was a time when the world felt thinner, more open. Sounds carried farther, shadows shifted unpredictably, and dreams became vivid. The jaguar ruled this realm. To understand the jaguar was to understand night itself. Dreams held particular importance in this context. Encounters with jaguars and dreams were not dismissed as imagination. They were messages, invitations, or warnings. A dream jaguar might signal initiation, transformation, or the need for caution. Such dreams were discussed, interpreted, and respected. The jaguar also served as a reminder of humility. No matter how organized society became, no matter how impressive cities or monuments grew, the jaguar remained beyond control. It could not be domesticated. It answered only to the rhythms of the forest. This independence reinforced the idea that human power had limits. Over time, jaguar symbolism became deeply embedded in Olmec culture, influencing later civilizations as well. The Maya and Aztec would inherit and adapt these ideas, weaving the jaguar into their own mythologies. Yet the Olmec vision remained foundational, shaping how power and transformation were imagined. What makes the jaguar's role especially compelling is its emotional resonance. It represented fear without chaos, strength without cruelty, and mystery without confusion. It taught that not everything needed to be understood fully to be respected. As night falls over the imagined Olmec landscape, the jaguar moves unseen through the forest. Its paws make no sound. Its eyes catch faint light. Somewhere nearby, people sit by a fire, telling stories that blur memory and myth. The jaguar exists both within those stories and beyond them, real and symbolic at once. In this way, the jaguar became more than an animal. It was a bridge between worlds, between states of being, between the known and the unknowable. It walked paths humans could not follow, yet its presence guided them. Even now, thousands of years later, the jaguar's image retains its power. It speaks to something ancient within the human mind, a recognition of forces larger than ourselves, a respect for transformation, and an acceptance of mystery. For the Olmecs, the jaguar was not something to conquer or tame. It was something to understand, to honor, and to listen to. And in the quiet space between heartbeat and breath, between waking and sleep, the jaguar still walks, carrying with it the memory of civilization that understood the power of moving gently between worlds. Long before roads were carved into the earth or maps were drawn to define borders, connection was already shaping the Olmec world. It moved quietly along rivers, through forests, and across mountains, carried not by armies or empires, but by people traveling with purpose. Trade was not simply an exchange of goods. It was an exchange of ideas, symbols, and understanding, and it allowed the Olmec civilization to reach far beyond its heartland without ever needing to conquer. The rivers of the Gulf Coast were the first pathways. Canoes slipped along their surfaces, guided by currents known intimately through generations of experience. These waterways linked distant communities, making movement easier than travel through dense jungle. Along these routes, people carried maize, tools, crafted objects, and stories. Each journey strengthened ties between groups and expanded a shared cultural language. Some materials traveled extraordinary distances. Jade, one of the most valued substances in the Olmec world, came from far-off regions where it had to be carefully extracted from the earth. Its smooth texture and rich green color made it more than decorative. It symbolized life, fertility, and continuity. To hold jade was to hold something enduring, something that seemed to carry the breath of the earth itself. Obsidian, sharp and glass-like, was another prized material. Its cutting edge made it invaluable for tools and ritual objects alike. Though dangerous to work with, its brilliance and effectiveness made it worth the effort. The presence of obsidian in Olmec centers reveals connections stretching deep into the highlands, linking cultures that might otherwise have remained isolated. These materials did not simply pass through Olmec hands unchanged. They were transformed, shaped into beads, figurines, tools, and ceremonial items that carried Olmec style and symbolism. When these objects traveled onward, they carried with them visual cues and meanings that others recognized and adapted. In this way, Olmec influence spread subtly, embedded in form rather than enforced by power. Trade relationships were built on trust and reciprocity. Exchanges were often ritualized, accompanied by gestures of respect and shared ceremony. The act of giving and receiving reinforced social bonds, creating networks of obligation and mutual support. These relationships helped stabilize the region, reducing conflict and encouraging cooperation. Through trade, the Olmecs encountered new ideas and practices. They did not absorb everything uncritically. Instead, they selected what resonated with their worldview, integrating new elements into existing traditions. This openness allowed Olmec culture to remain dynamic rather than static, capable of growth without losing coherence. Certain Olmec centers became hubs within these networks. Their locations, often near waterways or crossroads, made them natural gathering points. People from different regions came together, bringing with them diverse perspectives and experiences. These interactions enriched cultural life and expanded the scope of collective imagination. Symbols traveled as readily as goods. Motifs associated with Olmec art, particular facial features, hybrid forms, and ceremonial postures, appeared in distant regions. Sometimes they were copied closely. Other times they were reinterpreted. This spread suggests admiration and respect rather than domination. The Olmecs became a reference point, a source of cultural authority. The movement of goods also required organization. Leaders and specialists likely coordinated exchanges, ensuring fairness and continuity. This role further reinforced the authority of Olmec elites, whose influence extended beyond local boundaries. Trade thus supported both economic and political structures. It is important to understand that trade in the Olmec world was not driven by accumulation alone. Wealth was not hoarded for its own sake. Value materials were often used in ritual contexts or redistributed during ceremonies. This circulation reinforced social cohesion and prevented extreme inequality. As these networks expanded, the sense of belonging to a larger world grew stronger. Communities that had once seen themselves as isolated began to recognize their place within broader patterns. This awareness fostered a regional identity that transcended local differences. The calm nature of this expansion is striking. There is little evidence of large-scale conflict driven by trade competition. Instead, exchange appears to have functioned as a stabilizing force. By tying communities together through mutual dependence, trade reduced the incentive for violence. Trade routes also serve as channels for spiritual ideas. Ritual practices, symbols, and cosmological concepts moved alongside physical goods. These shared beliefs further strengthened connections, creating a common framework for understanding existence. Over time, the influence of Olmec trade networks became deeply embedded in Mesoamerican culture. Later civilizations would inherit these pathways, building upon them as they rose. The Olmec legacy thus extended forward, shaping the foundations of future societies. The quiet efficiency of these networks reveals much about Olmec values. They prioritize balance, reciprocity, and long-term relationships. Their approach to connection was patient and deliberate, avoiding the disruptions caused by forceful expansion. In imagining these journeys, one can picture traders setting out at dawn, canoes laden with goods, moving slowly along familiar routes. They navigated not only physical landscapes, but social ones, guided by customs and expectations refined over generations. When they arrived at distant settlements, exchanges unfolded through ritual and conversation. Stories were shared, news traveled, knowledge spread. These moments of interaction were as valuable as the goods themselves. As night fell and travelers rested, the sense of being part of something larger would have settled quietly. The world felt interconnected, alive with movement even beyond immediate sight. Through trade, the Olmecs demonstrated that influence does not require domination. Their civilization expanded its reach through shared meaning and mutual benefit, leaving traces in art, belief, and practice across Mesoamerica. This network of connection, carried by rivers and relationships, allowed Olmec culture to resonate far beyond its origins. It stands as a reminder that some of the most enduring forms of power move gently, shaping the world not through force, but through exchange, trust, and the steady flow of human connection. As San Lorenzo's influence began to soften and shift, the story of the Olmecs did not end. It simply moved, following the slow logic of rivers and land. To the east, closer to the coast, a new center of gravity emerged, one that would carry Olmec civilization into its next great phase. This place was La Venta, and unlike its predecessor, it rose not from a natural plateau, but from a landscape that required even greater intention to shape. La Venta stood amid low, marshy terrain, where the earth was soft and water never far away. To build here was an act of confidence. It required not only engineering skill, but belief that the effort was worth the risk, that the land could be transformed into a sacred center capable of holding power, memory, and meaning. Earth was gathered, carried, and layered carefully, forming massive mounds that rose above the wetlands like islands of order. At the heart of La Venta was a grand ceremonial core, larger and more symbolically complex than anything seen before. Long, carefully aligned plazas guided movement and attention. The arrangement of space felt deliberate, almost choreographed, as if those who planned it were shaping not just where people walked, but how they experienced the world. This was architecture as storytelling, written not in words, but in earth and stone. Dominating this landscape was a towering earthen pyramid, one of the earliest of its kind in Mesoamerica. It rose gradually, its slope smooth and imposing, commanding the horizon without sharp edges or defensive walls. This was not a structure meant to repel enemies. It was meant to draw eyes upward, to connect the human world with the sky above. Standing before it, one would have felt small, but not insignificant, part of something vast and ordered. La Venta was more than a replacement for San Lorenzo. It represented a refinement of Olmec ideas about power and ritual. Where San Lorenzo emphasized leadership through presence and portraiture, La Venta leaned heavily into symbolism and sacred geography. The city itself became a map of the cosmos, its layout reflecting beliefs about direction, balance, and the structure of the universe. Stone monuments remained central, but their role evolved. Colossal heads still appeared, but they shared space with altars, steely and intricately carved blocks that told more complex visual stories. Some depicted figures emerging from caves or niches, suggesting birth, rebirth, or communication with the underworld. Others showed rulers in postures of authority, framed by symbols of power and transformation. These images suggest that leadership at La Venta was deeply ceremonial. Rulers were not just remembered. They were positioned within mythic narratives. Their authority was reinforced by visual links to sacred origins and cosmic order. To rule was to occupy a place within the universe's design, not above it. La Venta also became a center of burial, an offering on an unprecedented scale. Beneath plazas and mounds, archaeologists have uncovered elaborate offerings, carefully arranged objects buried with intention. Jade figurines, polished stones, and symbolic items were placed in precise patterns, then sealed beneath layers of earth. These were not hidden treasures meant to be retrieved. They were gifts offered permanently to the earth and the forces it held. One of the most striking discoveries at La Venta is a massive offering composed of hundreds of jade pieces arranged to form symbolic designs. The labor involved in acquiring, shaping, and burying such valuable material speaks to extraordinary devotion. It was an act that valued meaning over possession, ritual over wealth. Daily life continued around this ceremonial heart. Ordinary people lived, worked, and raised families in surrounding areas, their routines still shaped by agriculture, craft, and community. Yet the presence of La Venta's monumental core would have influenced their sense of identity. It was a constant reminder of belonging to something larger, something ordered and sacred. Trade networks flourished during La Venta's rise. The city's location made it a natural hub, drawing materials and people from diverse regions. Jade, obsidian, shells, and other valued goods flowed into the city, only to be transformed and redistributed through ritual and exchange. La Venta became a place where the wider world converged. This convergence of people and ideas likely intensified cultural creativity. New artistic styles emerged, blending tradition with innovation. Symbols grew more layered, capable of carrying multiple meanings at once. The Olmec worldview did not remain static. It deepened, becoming more abstract and cosmological. Despite its grandeur, La Venta was not a place of excess for its own sake. There is little evidence of lavish palaces or private luxury. Power was displayed through public works, shared rituals, and offerings meant to be buried rather than enjoyed. This suggests a value system that prioritized collective meaning over individual accumulation. As decades passed, La Venta maintained its role as a ceremonial and cultural center. Generations were born into a world where its mounds and plazas had always existed. Rituals repeated, stories accumulated, and memory layered itself into the landscape. The city became timeless in the minds of those who lived within its influence. Yet even here, change was inevitable. Environmental pressures, shifting trade routes, or internal transformations gradually altered the city's role. The same patience that built La Venta also allowed it to be released. Activity slowed. Rituals grew less frequent. The ceremonial core was no longer the axis around which life revolved. What is remarkable is the absence of evidence for violent destruction. Like San Lorenzo before it, La Venta seems to have been left behind deliberately. Its sacred spaces closed rather than shattered. Offerings were buried, monuments left in place. The city was allowed to rest. In this gentle abandonment lies a profound insight into Olmec values. Places of power were not clung to indefinitely. When their time passed, they were honored and released. The land reclaimed them slowly, covering earthworks with vegetation, softening sharp lines into gentle contours. La Venta's legacy, however, did not fade. Its ideas traveled onward, influencing later cultures that would rise in the centuries to come. The concept of monumental ceremonial centers, aligned with cosmology and filled with symbolic offerings, became a defining feature of Mesoamerican civilization. In the quiet that followed La Venta's peak, its mounds stood against the sky, silent witnesses to human devotion and imagination. They held within them layers of meaning, memory, and belief, testaments to a civilization that understood power not as something to seize, but as something to shape, honor, and eventually let go. La Venda was power reborn, not louder than before, but deeper. It carried the Olmec story forward, refining its language of earth and stone, and in doing so, it left an imprint that would guide the sacred landscapes of Mesoamerica long after the Olmecs themselves had slipped into history's quiet sleep. Nothing dramatic announced the beginning of the Olmecs' decline. There were no burning cities, no invading armies recorded in stone, no sudden silence that marked a single catastrophic end. Instead, the change came the way many profound transformations do, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly to those living through it. The civilization that had shaped land, belief, and identity for centuries began to loosen its grip, not in panic, but in gradual release. At first, life likely felt much the same. Fields were still planted. Rituals were still performed. Rivers continued their seasonal rise and fall. Yet beneath the surface continuity, subtle shifts were unfolding. Environmental conditions may have begun to change, rivers altering their courses, floods becoming less predictable, soils less forgiving. In a landscape so dependent on balance, even small disruptions could ripple outward over time. The Olmecs had always lived in close dialogue with their environment. Their success depended on reading the land accurately and responding with care. But nature is never static. A river that once nourished fields could slowly turn destructive, eroding earthworks and disrupting transport routes. Marshlands could expand, making travel and settlement more difficult. These changes did not destroy civilization overnight, but they demanded constant adaptation. At the same time, the internal structure of Olmec society was evolving. Centers of power like La Vena had drawn people, resources, and meaning inward for generations. Over time, this concentration may have become difficult to sustain. As populations grew or shifted, as trade routes changed direction, the gravitational pull of these ceremonial centers weakened. Ritual life, so central to Olmec identity, may also have transformed. Beliefs do not vanish suddenly, but they do change as circumstances shift. Rituals that once felt effective and necessary might have lost some of their urgency. New interpretations, new symbols, or new local practices could have emerged, subtly decentralizing spiritual authority. Leadership, too, was not immune to change. Olmec rulers derived legitimacy from their ability to maintain balance between the human and sacred worlds. When environmental challenges intensified or social cohesion softened, this legitimacy may have been tested. Authority rooted in ritual is powerful, but it is also fragile, dependent on collective belief. There is evidence that monuments were moved, altered, or deliberately buried during this period. Such acts are deeply symbolic. They do not suggest chaos or disrespect, but transition. To bury a monument was not to erase it, but to acknowledge that its time had passed. It was an act of closure rather than destruction. People did not abandon their homes all at once. Some areas likely emptied gradually, as families relocated to regions offering better conditions or new opportunities. Others remained occupied for generations, even as their importance diminished. Civilization did not collapse inward. It diffused outward. Trade networks, once vibrant arteries of connection, may have shifted their focus. New centers arose elsewhere in Mesoamerica, drawing goods and ideas along different paths. As exchange patterns changed, the Olmec's role within these networks diminished. Influence does not disappear. It is redistributed. What is striking is the apparent absence of widespread violence. Archaeological evidence does not point to mass destruction or forced displacement. This suggests that the Olmecs did not fall because they were conquered, but because their way of organizing the world gradually became less viable under changing conditions. There is a quiet dignity in this kind of decline. It reflects a culture capable of letting go. Instead of clinging to places of power at all costs, the Olmecs seem to have accepted impermanence as part of the natural order. This acceptance was deeply aligned with their worldview, which emphasized cycles, transformation, and renewal. As ceremonial centers fell silent, they did not become ruins in the modern sense. They became dormant spaces. Vegetation slowly reclaimed plazas and mounds. Stones settled into the earth. The land absorbed what humans had shaped, folding it back into the landscape. Memory, however, did not vanish with the buildings. Stories persisted. Symbols continued to circulate. Beliefs were carried forward by people who moved on, adapting them to new contexts. The Olmecs did not disappear. They transformed. Later cultures would inherit fragments of Olmec thought, ideas about sacred landscapes, ritual authority, cosmology, and art. These fragments would be reinterpreted and expanded, woven into new traditions. In this way, decline became transmission. For those living at the end of the Olmec era, this transition may not have felt like an ending at all. It may have felt like change, like moving forward into uncertainty with familiar tools. Civilization does not always recognize its own turning points. As generations passed, the original meanings of monuments faded. Faces carved in stone remained, but the names they represented were forgotten. Rituals once charged with cosmic significance became echoes. Yet even in forgetting, there was continuity. The land remembered. What remains most compelling about the Olmec decline is its gentleness. In a historical narrative often dominated by violence and collapse, this story offers a different possibility. That civilizations can end without spectacle, without annihilation, by slowly releasing their hold on place and power. This long, quiet decline reminds us that endurance is not always about persistence in the same form. Sometimes it is about adaptation, diffusion, and memory carried forward in altered shapes. As night fell over abandoned plazas and mounds, there would have been no sense of finality. Crickets sang. Rivers flowed. The world continued. Civilization, in its Olmec form, was not destroyed. It simply exhaled. And in that exhale, it left behind something enduring, a foundation upon which others would build, ideas that would travel further than any city, and a lesson written not in conquest, but in acceptance. The Olmecs faded not in defeat, but in accordance with the rhythms they had always honored. Cycles of rise, transformation, and return. After the centers of power had loosened their hold, after rituals grew quieter and gatherings less frequent, a new kind of stillness settled over the Olmec landscape. It was not the stillness of sudden absence, but of gradual departure. Places once shaped by footsteps, voices, and intention began to empty, not all at once, but family by family, generation by generation. The cities did not fall. They were left behind. Paths that had once been worn smooth by daily movement grew softer under layers of fallen leaves. Plazas where ceremonies had drawn hundreds now echoed only with the sound of wind moving through grass. Stone monuments remained standing, but they no longer served as anchors of authority. They became witnesses instead, silent markers of a time when these spaces were alive with meaning. Vegetation returned patiently. Vines crept over earthen mounds. Roots pressed gently against carved stone. Trees took hold where open ground had once been carefully maintained. The jungle did not erase the cities violently. It absorbed them slowly, reclaiming what had always belonged to it. Human order yielded to natural rhythm. For those who left, the decision was likely not framed as abandonment. It was relocation, adjustment, survival. Perhaps a river no longer flowed as it once had. Perhaps soil had lost its richness. Perhaps new opportunities emerged elsewhere, new lands, new networks, new centers of gathering. The Olmec world did not end in one place. It continued in many others. Memory traveled with the people. Stories of old centers were told and retold, changing subtly with each telling. Children grew up hearing about places their parents had known, places of ceremony and power now distant and overgrown. These stories carried reverence, not regret. The past was honored, but not clung to. The abandoned cities themselves became something different. They were no longer homes or ceremonial hubs. They became liminal spaces, places between worlds. For those who passed nearby, they may have carried a sense of presence, a quiet power lingering in earth and stone. Such places are rarely forgotten completely. They shift in meaning. Stone heads gaze outward, their expressions unchanged as seasons pass around them. Rain darkened their surfaces. Sunlight warmed them. They remained while human activity moved on. In this way, the monuments fulfilled a role their creators may have intended all along, to endure beyond the life of the city, beyond the memory of individual rulers. Silence settled into these spaces, but it was not empty silence. It was filled with natural sound, the calls of birds, the movement of insects, the slow breath of wind through leaves. At night, darkness returned fully, uninterrupted by firelight or human presence. Stars reflected faintly in nearby water. The world reverted to an older rhythm. For later generations, these silent cities may have felt ancient even then. Without direct connection to their original purpose, they became part of the landscape's mythology, places where ancestors had walked, places where powerful rituals were once performed. Their exact meanings blurred, but their significance endured. Archaeological evidence suggests that some monuments were deliberately buried before abandonment. This act carries profound meaning. To bury something is to acknowledge its importance, not to discard it. It suggests closure, respect, and perhaps protection. The Olmecs did not smash their sacred spaces in anger. They closed them gently. This practice aligns with a worldview that accepted impermanence. Just as rituals mark transitions in human life, so too did civilizations pass through phases. A place could be sacred for a time, then released. Sacredness was not fixed. It moved with people and belief. As centuries passed, knowledge of the Olmec's origins faded. Their name disappeared. Their language fell silent. Yet traces of their ideas remained embedded in the cultures that followed. Symbols persisted. Ritual concepts endured. Sacred landscapes continued to matter. The silence of the abandoned cities thus became fertile ground. It allowed future civilizations to encounter the Olmec legacy not as a living authority, but as a deep presence. Later peoples would build near or upon these ancient sites, sensing their power even without fully understanding it. There is something profoundly human in this quiet ending. It mirrors the way individual lives conclude, not always with drama, but often with gradual withdrawal. A house once full of sound grows quiet. Objects remain. Memories linger. The space takes on a new character. In the Olmec world, time did not rush. Abandonment was not a failure, but a transition. The earth did not judge. It accepted what was offered back to it. Civilization returned to soil, becoming part of the long story of the land. For modern observers, the silence of these cities can feel haunting. We are accustomed to endings marked by collapse or conquest. The Olmec story challenges that expectation. It invites us to consider a different kind of ending, one defined by patience and acceptance. Standing among the ruins today, one might feel that the cities are not truly gone. They are resting. Their silence is not absence, but depth. It holds layers of activity, belief, and life compressed into stillness. The Olmecs did not vanish into nothingness. They dispersed into the flow of history, their identity transforming as it merged with new cultures. The cities they left behind became monuments not just to power, but to the ability to let go. In this silence, there is a lesson that resonates across time. Human creations, no matter how grand, are temporary. What endures is not the structure itself, but the understanding that shaped it. The Olmecs understood cycles. They lived within them. And when the time came, they allowed their cities to fall silent without fear. As dawn broke over an empty plaza long ago, sunlight would have touched stone that no longer served a living ritual. Birds would have settled where people once stood. Life continued, altered but unbroken. Civilization had moved on, leaving behind a quiet echo, one that still invites reflection, humility, and wonder. The silence of the Olmec cities is not a void. It is a pause. And within that pause lies the enduring presence of civilization that chose to fade softly, trusting the rhythms of the world it had always honored. Even after their great centers had fallen silent and their monuments were swallowed slowly by earth and forest, the Olmecs did not truly disappear. Their presence lingered in ways far subtler than stone or soil. It lived on in habits, symbols, and ways of seeing the world that traveled with people as they moved, settled, and adapted. The Olmecs became less a single civilization and more a current flowing quietly beneath the surface of Mesoamerica. As communities shifted and new centers emerged, the ideas formed during the Olmec era continue to shape behavior and belief. People carry with them concepts of sacred space, ritual authority, and cosmic balance. These ideas were not rigid doctrines, but flexible frameworks that could be reshaped without losing their core meaning. In this way, Olmec thought proved remarkably resilient. One of the most enduring aspects of this legacy was a belief that landscapes themselves could be sacred. Mountains, caves, rivers, and constructed mounds were not just physical features. They were places of connection between worlds. Later cultures would continue to build ceremonial centers aligned with natural features and celestial patterns, echoing an Olmec understanding that space could hold meaning. Artistic traditions also carried Olmec influence forward. Certain visual motifs, downturned mouths, heavy-lidded eyes, and hybrid human-animal forms, appeared again and again in later cultures, sometimes subtly, sometimes clearly. These images retained their symbolic power, even as their original stories faded. They spoke a visual language that did not require explanation. The Olmec approach to leadership left a lasting imprint. Authority was framed not merely as political dominance, but as sacred responsibility. Rulers were expected to maintain harmony between human society and the forces of the universe. This concept would reappear in later civilizations, shaping how kings and priests understood their roles. Ritual practices, too, bore Olmec fingerprints. Bloodletting, offerings, and ceremonies aligned with natural cycles remained central to Mesoamerican religious life for centuries. While details evolved, the underlying belief in reciprocity between humans and the sacred endured. The idea that balance must be actively maintained never truly faded. Even agricultural practices reflected continuity. The cultivation of maize and its associated rituals carried deep symbolic meaning tied to life, death, and rebirth. These associations, already present in Olmec times, became foundational myths for later peoples. Agriculture was not just survival, it was a sacred act. Trade networks established by the Olmecs continued to function long after their political centers declined. Routes remained open, connecting regions through exchange and interaction. Along these pathways traveled not only goods, but inherited ways of thinking. Cultural influence flowed forward, adapting to new contexts without losing its origins. The Olmecs also shaped how later cultures remembered the past. Their ancient sites, encountered by peoples who came after them, were often treated with reverence, even without knowing who built them or why. Later societies sensed their significance. These places became part of mythic landscapes, woven into new stories and interpretations. This layering of meaning is one of the Olmecs' most profound legacies. Their world did not vanish when their cities emptied. It became a foundation upon which others built, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. The past remained present, not as a static memory, but as a living influence. Language itself may have carried traces of Olmec thought. While their spoken word are lost, certain concepts, such as the sacredness of time and the cyclical nature of existence, persisted across linguistic boundaries. Ideas outlast the vocabulary. The Olmec emphasis on transformation shaped later mythologies. Stories of gods who died and were reborn, of humans who crossed between worlds, of animals that embody divine power, all reflect a worldview comfortable with change and ambiguity. This comfort will become a hallmark of Mesoamerican spirituality. Even the act of building monumental architecture followed Olmec precedent. Later civilizations constructed pyramids and ceremonial platforms not as mere displays of power, but as symbolic mountains, places where heaven and earth met. This concept can be traced back to Olmec experimentation with sacred space. The survival of these ideas suggests that the Olmecs achieved something rare. They created a cultural framework flexible enough to survive the loss of its original form. Their influence did not depend on continuous political dominance. It lived on through adaptation. This endurance challenges modern assumptions about legacy. We often equate lasting impact with visible monuments or written records. The Olmecs left few of either, yet their influence shaped entire civilizations that followed. Their legacy was carried in practice rather than proclamation. As centuries passed, new peoples rose to prominence. They developed their own identities, languages, and histories. Yet beneath these differences lay shared patterns of belief and expression that trace back to the Olmec era. Continuity existed alongside change. In this sense, the Olmecs never truly left. They became part of the cultural DNA of Mesoamerica, their way of understanding the world. Its cycles, its sacredness, its need for balance continue to guide human behavior long after their name was forgotten. There is a quiet beauty in this kind of survival. It does not demand recognition. It does not announce itself. It simply persists, shaping outcomes invisibly. The Olmecs remind us that influence does not always look like control. Sometimes it looks like resonance. When later civilizations look back, consciously or unconsciously, they found themselves inheriting a worldview already shaped by those who came before. The Olmecs had asked fundamental questions about existence, power, and humanity's place in the universe. Their answers continued to echo. In the end, the Olmecs were not a chapter that closed. They were a foundation that remained. Their civilization did not end in silence alone, but in transformation into something larger and longer lasting than themselves. They became a memory embedded in culture, a presence felt rather than named. And in that quiet persistence, they achieved a form of immortality, not through dominance or conquest, but through ideas strong enough to outlive the people who first imagined them. Long after their cities had returned to Earth, the Olmecs continued to shape the world, not as rulers or builders, but as ancestors whose thoughts still guided the hands and minds of those who followed. In this way, they never truly left. They simply changed their form, becoming part of the ongoing human story woven across the lands they once called home. As new civilizations began to rise across Mesoamerica, they did not do so in isolation. The land they inhabited was already layered with memory, shaped by ideas that had traveled quietly through generations. When the Maya, the Zapotec, and other cultures emerged, they stepped into a world already organized by patterns of thought that stretched back to the Olmecs. Even if the names and faces of those early people were forgotten, their shadow remained. For the Maya, the influence was subtle but profound. Their fascination with time, cycles, and celestial order did not appear from nowhere. The careful observation of the sky, the belief that time itself was sacred and alive, had deep roots in earlier Olmec thinking. Long before Maya scribes carved dates into stone, the Olmecs had already framed existence as a series of repeating rhythms: birth and decay, light and darkness, planting and harvest. This understanding shaped how later cultures interpreted the cosmos. The Maya calendar systems, complex and precise, echoed an older belief that time was not linear but cyclical. Days carried personality. Moments carried weight. These ideas aligned closely with the Olmec worldview, where rituals marked transitions and balance was constantly renewed. Maya art also reveals traces of Olmec ancestry. Certain facial features, downward mouths, heavy-lidded eyes, and broad noses, appear in early Maya sculpture and reliefs. These were not direct copies, but inherited visual languages. Over time, the Maya refined and expanded these styles, embedding them within their own narratives and deities. The concept of divine kingship offers another clear connection. Maya rulers were not merely political leaders. They were sacred figures responsible for maintaining harmony between worlds. This idea mirrors Olmec notions of leadership as spiritual mediation. Kings performed bloodletting rituals, communicated with ancestors, and aligned their actions with cosmic events, roles that had precedent centuries earlier. The Zapotecs, rising in the Oaxaca Valley, carried the Olmec shadow in different ways. Their early ceremonial centers show similarities in layout and symbolic orientation. Platforms, plazas, and sacred spaces reflect a shared understanding that architecture could encode meaning. Building was not only about shelter or defense. It was about expressing a worldview in stone and earth. Zapotec art also reveals hybrid imagery and symbolic abstraction reminiscent of Olmec traditions. Figures carved into stone stele often suggest transformation and power rather than literal representation. This emphasis on symbolic meaning over realism echoes Olmec artistic priorities. Ritual practices provide some of the strongest evidence of continuity. Bloodletting, offerings, and ceremonies tied to agricultural cycles appear across Mesoamerican cultures. While each civilization adapted these practices to its own needs and beliefs, the underlying principle of reciprocity between humans and the sacred endured. The Olmecs had framed existence as an exchange, and later cultures continued to live within that framework. Ball games offer another point of connection. Though the Olmecs did not leave written rules, archaeological evidence suggests they practiced early forms of the ritual ball game that would later become central to Maya and other cultures. This game was never just sport. It symbolized cosmic struggle, movement, and renewal, concepts deeply aligned with Olmec cosmology. The Zapotecs and Maya both inherited the Olmec sense that certain animals carried spiritual power. The jaguar, in particular, remained a potent symbol of authority, night, and transformation. Though each culture interpreted the jaguar differently, its core meaning persisted. The Olmecs had established the jaguar as a bridge between worlds, and later civilizations continue to walk that bridge. Writing systems, too, may owe something to Olmec experimentation. While direct evidence remains debated, some of the earliest glyphic symbols in Mesoamerica appear in Olmec contexts. These proto-symbols suggest an early attempt to fix meaning visually, a step that would later flourish in Maya script. Even if the systems were not directly inherited, the conceptual leap toward recording time, names, and events had already been made. Trade networks ensured that these influences did not remain static. As goods moved between regions, so did symbols and stories. A jade figurine carved in an Olmec style could end up in a Zapotec or Maya context, where it would be reinterpreted through local belief. In this way, Olmec ideas continued to evolve rather than fossilize. What is striking is how later civilizations did not treat Olmec influence as something foreign. It was already woven into the cultural fabric. The past did not feel distant. It felt ancestral. This sense of continuity allowed new societies to innovate without severing their connection to earlier wisdom. Even differences between these cultures reveal shared roots. Where the Maya developed complex written histories, the Zapotecs emphasized monumental inscriptions tied to lineage and conquest. Yet both approaches reflect an inherited belief that memory mattered, that human actions were worth recording and preserving. The Olmecs had already demonstrated this through stone portraits and symbolic monuments. The endurance of Olmec ideas also shaped how later civilizations understood decline and renewal. The Maya, for example, experienced cycles of city abandonment and resurgence. Their acceptance of these cycles mirrors Olmec comfort with impermanence. Collapse was not always seen as failure, but as transition. In religious mythology, the echoes grow louder. Creation stories involving emergence from earth caves or watery realms appear across Mesoamerica. These themes align closely with Olmec imagery of figures emerging from niches or caves carved in stone. The idea that life originates from hidden, sacred spaces was an Olmec inheritance. Even the orientation of ceremonial centers toward cardinal directions and celestial events reflects shared cosmological assumptions. The land itself was organized according to invisible order. Building in harmony with that order was essential. This principle guided Olmec planning and remained central for later cultures. Over time, the Olmecs faded from direct memory. Their name was lost, their language silenced. Yet their influence did not require recognition to persist. It lived on through practice, belief, and structure. The Maya and Zapotecs were not imitators. They were inheritors. This inheritance did not constrain creativity. On the contrary, it provided a foundation strong enough to support innovation. Each civilization took what it needed, reshaped it, and added new layers. The result was a rich tapestry of cultures distinct yet interconnected. In this way, the Olmecs became something more than a civilization. They became a point of origin, a deep root from which many branches grew. Their shadow stretched across centuries, guiding without commanding, influencing without ruling. When later peoples looked to the past, whether through myth, ritual, or stone, they encountered traces of Olmec thought embedded in their own traditions. The ancestors spoke not through words, but through patterns repeated so often they felt natural. This is the quiet power legacy. It does not demand remembrance. It simply continues. And in the rise of the Maya, the Zapotecs, and others, the Olmecs lived on not as rulers of the present, but as architects of the cultural landscape itself. Their civilization may have ended, but their influence never truly did. It passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, shaping how people saw the world, understood time, and placed themselves within the vast, living universe of Mesoamerica. For thousands of years, the Olmecs existed only as a faint echo beneath the soil, their cities folded into the land, their monuments hidden by forest and time. Empires rose and fell above them, unaware that beneath their feet lay the remains of a civilization older than memory. The Olmecs did not wait to be rediscovered. They simply slept. When the modern world finally began to notice them, it was not through grand announcements or sudden revelations. It happened gradually, almost accidentally, as fragments of stone emerged where they were not expected. Farmers clearing land found carved blocks unlike anything they had seen. Workers cutting through jungle encountered massive faces buried in earth. These moments were quiet, confusing, and easily dismissed at first. In the 19th century, explorers and scholars traveling through southern Mexico encountered strange sculptures scattered across the Gulf Coast. Some were half buried, others repurposed as building material by local communities who had long lived alongside them. The scale of these carvings defied explanation. They did not resemble known Maya or Aztec art. They seemed older, heavier, more grounded. Early reactions were marked by disbelief. The idea that indigenous cultures of the Americas could produce such monumental works so early challenged deeply held assumptions shaped by colonial thinking. Rather than revise those assumptions, many observers reached for more comfortable explanations. Fantastical theories emerged, suggesting lost continents, vanished races, or visitors from distant lands. These stories said more about the fears and biases of the modern world than about the ancient past. As archaeology developed into a more rigorous discipline, a different approach slowly took hold. Instead of imposing external narratives, researchers began to listen to the land itself. Careful excavation revealed layers of occupation, each telling a story of gradual development rather than sudden appearance. Pottery fragments, tools, and architectural remains painted a picture of continuity. The discovery of colossal heads in places like San Lorenzo and La Venta became turning points. Their sheer size demanded explanation grounded in human effort. Scholars began to ask not who could have built them, but how and why. These questions shifted the conversation away from myth and toward evidence. Dating techniques revealed something astonishing. These monuments were older than many of the civilizations long celebrated as the origins of Mesoamerican culture. The realization unsettled established timelines. History had to be rewritten to make room for a civilization that had quietly preceded others by centuries. The name Olmec itself was a product of this rediscovery, borrowed from a later Nahuatl term meaning rubber people. It reflected the region's historical association with rubber production rather than the people who originally lived there. The true name of the Olmecs remains unknown, a reminder of how much has been lost. As more sites were uncovered, patterns emerged. The Olmecs were not an isolated anomaly, but a widespread culture with multiple centers connected by shared beliefs and practices. Their influence radiated outward, touching regions far beyond their heartland. This realization reframed them not as a curiosity, but as a foundational civilization. Modern archaeology brought with it new tools and perspectives. Aerial surveys revealed the scale of earthworks hidden beneath vegetation. Soil analysis uncovered traces of ancient agriculture. Careful study of iconography revealed a coherent symbolic language. Each discovery added depth to the picture, filling in gaps left by silence. Perhaps most striking was the realization that the Olmecs had achieved so much without technologies considered essential elsewhere. They had no metal tools, no draft animals, no writing system preserved in stone. Yet they moved massive stones, planned cities, and shaped a worldview that endured for millennia. This forced a reevaluation of what civilization truly requires. Local communities played an essential role in this rediscovery. Many had long known of the ancient stones, incorporating them into their own landscapes and stories. Their knowledge, often overlooked, proved invaluable. The past was not entirely forgotten. It had been living quietly alongside the present. Museums and academic institutions began to take notice. Olmec artifacts were collected, studied, and displayed. While this brought recognition, it also raised questions about ownership and context. Removed from their original settings, the objects risked becoming disconnected from the landscapes and meanings that gave them life. As understanding deepened, interpretations grew more nuanced. Scholars moved beyond simple labels, recognizing the diversity within Olmec culture. They acknowledged regional variation, temporal change, and the complexity of social structures. The Olmecs were no longer a monolithic mystery, but a dynamic civilization. Public awareness grew slowly. The Olmecs did not capture popular imagination in the same way as the Maya or Aztecs. Their lack of written records and dramatic collapse made them harder to narrate. Yet for those who encountered them, the impact was profound. The calm faces carved in stone invited contemplation rather than spectacle. The rediscovery of the Olmecs also sparked broader reflection. It highlighted how easily history can be obscured, how narratives can erase entire cultures. It reminded scholars and the public alike that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The ground holds stories patiently, waiting for the right questions to be asked. In recent decades, collaboration between archaeologists, local communities, and indigenous scholars has enriched understanding. Perspectives grounded in lived experience have challenged earlier interpretations shaped by distance and bias. The Olmecs are increasingly understood not as relics, but as ancestors. Despite advances, many questions remain unanswered. We still do not know what the Olmecs called themselves, how their language sounded, or how they understood their own origins. This uncertainty is not a failure. It is an invitation to humility. The modern rediscovery of the Olmecs is ongoing. Each excavation, each analysis, each conversation adds another layer. The story continues to unfold, shaped by curiosity and respect rather than conquest. In a sense, the Olmecs have returned not as a civilization to be revived, but as a presence to be acknowledged. They remind us that history is deeper than written records, that human ingenuity has many forms, and that some of the most influential cultures leave their mark quietly. They slept beneath the soil for centuries, their cities dissolving into the landscape, their names fading from memory. When they emerged again, it was not with noise or spectacle, but with stone faces gazing calmly into a world that had forgotten them. And perhaps that is fitting. The Olmecs did not seek to be remembered through words. They trusted stone, earth, and time. When the modern world finally listened, it found not answers shouted from the past, but quiet invitation to look closer, think deeper, and reconsider what it means to be ancient, influential, and human. When the Olmecs finally re-entered modern awareness, they did not come alone. They arrived surrounded by speculation, misunderstanding, and stories that often said more about the people telling them than about the ancient civilization itself. In the absence of written records and familiar historical markers, silence invited imagination, and imagination rushed in to fill the gaps. One of the earliest and most persistent misunderstandings was a refusal to believe that the Olmecs could have been indigenous to the Americas at all. The colossal stone heads, with their immense scale and confident craftsmanship, unsettled long-standing assumptions about the capabilities of ancient American societies. For some early observers, it seemed easier to invent lost continents or vanished races than to accept that complex civilizations could arise independently in the New World. These ideas were not born from evidence, but from bias. They reflected a worldview that placed Europe and the Old World at the center of human achievement, relegating other regions to the margins. In this framework, the Olmecs became an anomaly that needed external explanation. The truth that they were the product of generations of local knowledge, adaptation, and creativity was slow to gain acceptance. As the 20th century progressed, another layer of myth emerged, shaped less by colonial prejudice and more by fascination with the unknown. The Olmecs became linked to stories of ancient astronauts, extraterrestrial visitors, and advanced technologies lost to time. The stone heads were reimagined as depictions of beings from distant worlds. Their age was exaggerated, their origins distorted, their humanity quietly erased. These stories gained popularity not because they were supported by evidence, but because they were dramatic. They offered mystery without responsibility, wonder without understanding. In doing so, they stripped the Olmecs of their cultural context, turning a real civilization into a canvas for modern fantasy. What these myths overlook is something far more compelling than fiction. The reality of the Olmecs, people shaping monumental art with stone tools, organizing society without writing or metal, and developing a worldview that would influence centuries of history, is extraordinary precisely because it is human. There is no need to reach beyond the earth to explain it. Another common misunderstanding lies in the idea of the Olmecs as a single, unified empire. This image, shaped by later civilizations like the Aztecs, imposes a familiar structure onto a culture that functioned very differently. The Olmecs were not an empire defined by borders and conquest. They were a network of communities connected by shared beliefs, practices, and artistic traditions. Their influence spread not through domination, but through resonance. Symbols traveled because they were meaningful. Practices endured because they worked. Ideas persisted because they addressed fundamental human concerns: balance, transformation, connection to the sacred. To mistake this for imperial control is to misunderstand the nature of their power. There is also a tendency to romanticize the Olmecs as a perfectly harmonious society, untouched by conflict or inequality. This, too, is a distortion. Like all human cultures, the Olmecs would have experienced tension, struggle, and disagreement. Leadership brought responsibility, but also privilege. Ritual authority created order, but also hierarchy. Recognizing this complexity does not diminish the Olmecs. It honors them. It acknowledges that they were not mythical beings or idealized ancestors, but real people navigating the challenges of their world with the tools and understanding available to them. Modern scholarship has worked carefully to separate evidence from speculation. Archaeology, when practiced with patience and humility, resists the urge for easy answers. It builds understanding slowly, fragment by fragment. A broken figurine, a buried offering, a shift in settlement patterns. Each contributes a small piece to a much larger picture. One of the most important truths to emerge from this work is how much remains unknown. We do not know the Olmecs' own name for themselves. We do not know the full structure of their language. We do not know the precise meanings of many symbols carved into stone. This uncertainty is often uncomfortable, especially in a culture accustomed to definitive narratives. Yet there is value in not knowing everything. It forces respect. It reminds us that the past is not a puzzle designed for modern satisfaction, but a lived reality that does not owe us complete explanation. The Olmecs are not a mystery to be solved once and for all. They are a history to be approached with care. Another misconception arises from the desire to label the Olmecs as the mother culture of Mesoamerica in an overly simplistic way. While it is true that their influence was profound, framing them as the sole origin of all later developments risks erasing the contributions of other societies. Cultural evolution is rarely linear. It is collaborative, cumulative, and often simultaneous. The Olmecs were innovators, but they were also participants in a broader regional conversation. They absorbed ideas as well as generated them. Their legacy is best understood not as a single source, but as a powerful current within a larger flow of human creativity. There is also the question of race and appearance, often entangled with misunderstanding. The facial features of the colossal heads have been misinterpreted and misused to support unfounded theories about transoceanic contact. These interpretations ignore both artistic style and the diversity of indigenous populations in the Americas. Art does not function as a photographic record. It emphasizes meaning, identity, and symbolism. The Olmec heads are not evidence of outsiders. They are expressions of local leadership, carved with intention and cultural context. To deny this is to deny indigenous history its rightful depth. Over time, as scholarship has become more inclusive and interdisciplinary, a quieter, more grounded truth has emerged. For the Olmecs, time was not something that rushed forward in a straight line. It did not begin at a single point and race endlessly toward an unknown end. Time moved differently. It breathed. It returned. It folded back on itself, carrying memory, loss, and renewal in equal measure. To understand the Olmecs is to step out of modern urgency and into a slower rhythm, one that values repetition as much as progress. Their world was shaped by cycles that could be felt rather than measured. The rising and falling of rivers, the return of rains, the growth of maize from seed to stalk, and back to seed again. These patterns taught a quiet lesson. Nothing truly disappeared. It changed form, withdrew, and came back renewed. Life itself was a loop, not a ladder. This understanding shaped how the Olmecs lived, governed, and worshipped. Rituals were timed to moments of transition, not to fixed calendars carved in stone. The turning of seasons mattered more than numbered years. Certain days felt heavier than others, charged with meaning because they sat at the edge of change. Planting time, harvest time, the moment before rain. the silence after ritual. Time was not owned by humans. Humans move within it. Unlike modern societies that measure time as a resource to be spent or wasted, the Olmecs experienced time as a presence. It surrounded them, shaped them, and reminded them constantly of limits. A life was not defined by speed or accumulation, but by alignment. To live well was to move in harmony with the larger rhythms of the world. This perspective softened the fear of endings. When cities declined, when leaders died, when rituals faded, these events were not seen as absolute conclusions. They were transformations. Just as maize returned to earth before rising again, so too did human creations pass through phases of visibility and rest. The Olmecs' comfort with impermanence is visible everywhere in their legacy. They built monumental centers, yet they did not cling to them forever. They carved rulers in stone, yet they buried those monuments when their time had passed. Power was never imagined as eternal. It was seasonal. In this way, the Olmecs understood something deeply human, that permanence is an illusion and that resisting change only creates imbalance. Their civilization did not collapse because it failed to endure. It transformed because it understood that endurance does not require sameness. The natural world reinforced this lesson daily. Floods erased boundaries. Forests reclaimed clearings. Storms reshaped coastlines. To live in the Gulf lowlands was to accept instability as normal. The Olmecs did not fight this reality. They adapted to it, learning when to build, when to move, and when to let go. This approach influenced their spiritual beliefs as well. Deities were not distant, unchanging figures. They were forces that moved, shifted, and responded. Gods were associated with rain, growth, decay, and renewal, processes rather than personalities. Worship was not about submission to fixed rules, but participation in ongoing cycles. Blood rituals, often misunderstood, must be seen through this lens. Blood was not offered to appease angry gods, but to sustain balance. It symbolized life's flow, the same force that moved sap through plants and water through rivers. By offering blood, humans returned energy to the system that sustained them. Time was also present in the way the Olmecs understood ancestry. The dead were not gone. They had simply shifted into another phase of existence. Ancestors remained connected to the living, influencing dreams, guiding decisions, and shaping memory. The past was not behind them. It was beneath them, supporting the present. This layered sense of time created a worldview where patience was a virtue. Decisions were made with an awareness of long-term consequences. Projects unfolded over generations. A mound built today might reach its full significance long after its builders were gone. This was not wasteful. It was purposeful. The Olmecs did not rush to record their history in writing. Instead, they embedded it in landscape and ritual. Memory lived in repeated actions rather than permanent texts. Stories were told and retold, changing subtly with each generation, remaining alive rather than fixed. This fluidity challenges modern expectations. We often seek definitive timelines, exact dates, clear beginnings and ends. The Olmec world resists this. Its time is circular, layered, and intentionally vague, not because it lacked precision, but because precision was not the goal. Their influence on later Mesoamerican cultures reveals how powerful this conception of time truly was. The Maya would later formalize cycles into complex calendars, but the underlying philosophy remained the same. Time was sacred. It carried meaning. It required respect. Even the ball game, inherited and transformed by later cultures, symbolized this understanding. The movement of the ball mirrored celestial cycles, descent into the underworld, and return to light. Victory and loss mattered less than participation in the cycle itself. When the Olmec civilization began to fade, this philosophy softened the transition. There was no frantic attempt to preserve power at all costs, no desperate effort to freeze a moment in place. Instead, people moved, adapted, and carried their beliefs forward in new forms. This acceptance is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Olmec thought. It runs counter to modern anxiety about decline and disappearance. The Olmecs remind us that civilizations do not have to die loudly to matter deeply. In quiet moments, When night settled over abandoned plazas and forests reclaimed stone, time continued its work, not erasing, but integrating. Human effort returned to earth. Memory transformed into influence. Even today, standing before an Olmec monument evokes this sense of temporal depth. The stone does not feel ancient in the way ruins often do. It feels patient, as if it is waiting not for restoration, but for recognition. The Olmecs understood that time would eventually outlast everything they built. Rather than fighting this truth, they built within it. Their monuments were not attempts at immortality. Stone has a way of outlasting intention. Long after voices fade and rituals fall silent, it remains, cool to the touch, unmoved by generations passing around it. For the Olmecs, stone was not chosen simply because it was durable. It was chosen because it carried weight, memory, and presence. In carving stone, they were not trying to defeat time. They were acknowledging it. When an Olmec sculptor shaped basalt into a human face, the act was both practical and philosophical. Stone demanded patience. It resisted haste. Every strike mattered. In the slow dialogue between hand and material, there was an understanding that whatever emerged would likely outlive its maker. This was not immortality in the modern sense. It was participation in a longer story. The colossal heads, in particular, reveal this relationship between stone and memory. They do not depict gods removed from humanity. They depict people, leaders whose authority was grounded in community, ritual, and responsibility. By carving their likeness into stone, the Olmecs were not claiming eternal rule. They were acknowledging continuity. Leadership would change. Faces would age and pass. Stone would remain as witness. Memory, in the Olmec world, was not stored in written words. It was embedded in landscape and material. A mound remembered those who built it. A carved figure remembered those it represented. Memory was physical, not abstract. It could be walked around, touched, and seen from different angles as the sun moved across the sky. This approach to memory contrasts sharply with modern efforts to preserve everything. We record, archive, and replicate endlessly, driven by fear of forgetting. The Olmecs accepted forgetting as part of the process. What mattered was not preserving every detail, but leaving enough behind to guide future understanding. Stone allowed for this balance. It preserved presence without explanation. A face carved in basalt does not tell you who it was or what it did. It tells you only that someone mattered enough to be remembered. The rest is left to interpretation, to imagination, to quiet reflection. There is humility in this restraint. The Olmecs did not inscribe their achievements in boastful lists. They did not demand recognition from the future. They allowed stone to speak in its own language, slow, patient, and incomplete. Human fragility stands in stark contrast to this endurance. Lives are brief. Societies change. Beliefs evolve. Even civilizations, for all their complexity, are temporary. The Olmecs understood this not as a tragedy, but as a condition of existence. Their acceptance of fragility shaped how they built and how they let go. When ceremonial centers lost their purpose, they were not destroyed in anger. They were buried, closed, or left to rest. Stone was returned to earth. Memory was allowed to soften. This process mirrors human life. Childhood gives way to adulthood. Strength fades into age. Eventually, the body returns to the elements. The Olmecs did not resist this cycle. They mirrored it in their culture. Stone, in this context, was not an attempt to escape fragility. It was a reminder of it. By choosing a material that would endure beyond individual lives, the Olmecs highlighted the contrast between permanence and impermanence. Stone remains, but its meaning changes. A colossal head that once commanded reverence could later become a silent landmark. Its authority dissolved, but its presence endured. This transformation did not erase its significance. It deepened it. Over centuries, stone gathered layers of meaning, first as representation, then as memory, later as mystery. Each generation encountered it differently, projecting its own understanding onto the same form. Stone did not resist these interpretations. It accepted them all. This openness is part why Olmec monuments feel so powerful today. They do not tell us what to think. They invite us to sit with uncertainty. In their silence, they mirror our own questions about time, legacy, and meaning. Human fragility is often framed as weakness. The Olmecs saw it differently. Fragility was what made balance necessary. It was what demanded care, ritual, and respect for cycles. Without fragility, there would be no need for harmony. This perspective softened fear of loss. When a leader died, the world did not end. When a city was abandoned, meaning did not vanish. It shifted. Stone absorbed the transition. The Olmec's relationship with stone also reveals an understanding of scale. They built monuments large enough to be noticed, but not so large as to dominate the landscape completely. Their structures rose from the earth rather than towering aggressively over it. Stone was integrated, not imposed. This integration reflected a worldview that saw humans as participants in nature rather than masters of it. Stone came from mountains, shaped by time beyond human reckoning. By carving it, the Olmecs entered into conversation with deep time. That conversation continues today. When we encounter Olmec stone, we are not just looking at art. We are touching a moment where human intention met geological patience. The result is something that belongs to neither fully, but to the space between. Night returns gently to the landscape where the Olmecs once lived, not as darkness that erases, but as a soft covering that settles over earth and memory alike. The heat of the day fades slowly, released from stone and soil, and the world exhales. In this quiet, the Olmecs feel closer, not as a civilization to be studied, but as a presence to be sensed. Imagine standing where a ceremonial plaza once opened to sky. The ground beneath your feet is uneven now, softened by centuries of rain and roots. Grass grows where people once gathered. The outlines of platforms are barely visible, hinted at rather than declared. And yet, something remains. A feeling that this place mattered, that it held intention. Moonlight slides across the contours of the land, revealing shapes that daylight often overlooks. An earthen mound catches silver light, its form still deliberate despite the passage of time. Nearby, stone rests half submerged, its surface cool and patient. The colossal faces, if they are present, do not dominate the night. They blend into it, their expressions calm, their gaze unhurried. In the quiet of night, it becomes easy to understand why the Olmecs chose stone, earth, and silence as their language. Night removes urgency. It strips away distraction. What remains is presence. The sound that fill this darkness are not empty. Insects hum in steady rhythms. Frogs call from hidden water. Leaves shift softly as the forest breathes. These sounds are not interruptions. They are continuity. They're the same sounds the Olmecs would have heard, rising from the same land long before modern time-keeping divided night from day. Firelight once flickered here. Shadows danced against carved surfaces. Voices rose and fell in ritual cadence. Now those voices are gone, but the night remembers their shape. Silence does not mean absence. It means rest. The Olmecs understood night not as an ending, but as a necessary phase. Day brought work, ritual, movement. Night brought reflection, dreams, and connection to deeper layers of existence. The boundary between worlds felt thinner after sunset. The unseen felt closer. In this darkness, time loosens its grip. Centuries collapse inward. The distance between now and then feels less rigid. It is possible to imagine people moving through the space again, not vividly, not loudly, but as impressions. The weight of footsteps, the warmth of bodies gathered together, the shared attention directed towards something meaningful. Night has a way of dissolving hierarchy. Under the same sky, ruler and farmer were equally small. Stars stretched endlessly above them, indifferent to human concerns. This vastness was not frightening. It was grounding. It placed individual lives within a larger order. The Olmecs did not fear this order. They aligned themselves with it. Their rituals often took place at dawn or dusk, moments when night and day overlapped. These thresholds mattered because they mirrored the transitions humans experience between life and death, certainty and mystery, presence and absence. In the modern world, night is often pushed away. Lights extend the day. Silence is filled. Darkness is treated as something to be conquered. But in the Olmec world, night was embraced. It was a teacher. Standing in the imagined stillness of an Olmec site at night, one can sense this teaching. Nothing demands attention. Nothing rushes. The land simply exists. And in that existence, it invites reflection. The stone faces, if you look closely, seem different at night. Their features soften. The lines carved by human hands blend with shadow. They no longer feel like monuments. They feel like companions, quiet witnesses sharing the same darkness. These faces have seen many nights, more than any human could count. Nights of ritual and celebration, nights of abandonment, nights of rain washing soil over their features, nights of stars shifting slowly overhead. They do not react. They do not judge. They remain. There is comfort in that constancy, not because it promises permanence, but because it accepts change without resistance. The Olmecs did not carve stone to freeze time. They carved it to participate in time. Night makes this clearer. In the absence of distraction, meaning emerges without effort. The mind slows. Thoughts drift. Boundaries soften. This is why the Olmec story feels so suited to the night. It does not demand analysis. It invites presence. It allows the listener to move gently between history and feeling, between knowledge and rest. As the night deepens, imagination becomes less linear. Images arise and fade without urgency. A river reflecting moonlight, a hand touching cool stone, a breath held in ritual silence. These impressions do not need explanation. They simply are. The Olmecs understood the power of such moments. They built spaces that held attention without overwhelming it, plazas that opened to the sky, mound that rose gently rather than sharply, monuments that invited contemplation rather than awe. In the night, these choices make sense. They create an environment where the human mind can settle, where awareness can expand without strain. Perhaps this is why the Olmecs remain so compelling, not because of what we know about them, but because of how they make us feel. Calm, curious, grounded. Night strips away the need for certainty. It allows questions to exist without answers. The Olmecs lived comfortably within that uncertainty. Their civilization did not hinge on control or permanence. It flowed. As sleep approaches, the world narrows to simple sensations. Breath, weight, stillness. The Olmec worldview aligns with this narrowing. It does not pull the mind outward into endless detail. It draws it inward toward balance. In this state, it becomes easier to accept impermanence, to understand that things can matter deeply without lasting forever. That meaning does not require endless extension. The Olmecs knew this. They built, honored, and released. They allowed their cities to rest. They trusted the land to hold what mattered. Night is that resting place. For the land, for memory, for the mind. As the listener drifts closer to sleep, the Olmec world does not fade. It softens. It becomes part of the background rhythm of thought, like distant water or wind through leaves. There is no final image, no dramatic conclusion, only a sense of continuity. The same stars above, the same earth below. Human presence moving through time like a brief, meaningful breath. The Olmecs are no longer subject. They are a feeling, a quiet awareness that civilization does not need a shout to endure, that silence can carry as much meaning as sound. In the deep of night, when thought slows and the world feels wide and gentle, their story settles naturally, not as history to be remembered, but as rhythm to be felt. And in that rhythm, rest comes easily. The land remains. Stone remains. Time moves. And somewhere within that movement, the Olmecs continue to exist, not awake, not gone, but resting quietly, exactly where they belong.